What's up guys, Houndish here, and today we're going to talk about Destiny 2's cut and unreleased content, looking at some of the myths and legends of inaccessible content, plus some interesting secrets. And so I'll touch on some gameplay we've seen but never experienced, hidden areas, unreleased weapons and exotic items, as well as entire destinations which started out very differently to what we ultimately saw in the game. This video is a little bit different, but as always I hope you enjoy it, and if you guys can think of any similar things which aren't on the list, then let us know down below. And now, let's get into it. Initially, one of the interesting things that folks speak about in the community is the bridge in the Dreaming City from Forsaken. And back in one of the Dreaming City trailers, Bungie actually showed an image of a Guardian driving across the bridge. And it's the same bridge you cross in the Last Wish raid, and that goes across this strand in the Dreaming City destination. However, it's something that we've never been able to actually do in the game. And of course, with something like this, it takes time for players to kind of realize it's a thing. Looking back at the trailers and seeing that Spyro drive across and then thinking, actually, that's not something we can do. But I guess there are two possibilities. Maybe at some point in development, Bungie had an area that is accessible on the other side of the bridge. Or of course, the other possibility is that it was entirely staged, just to look cool for the trailer, essentially. And to this day, it's something that folks in the community talk about and reference. So share your thoughts about that one. Another random fact, an interesting one here, but the Korean version of Destiny 2, Destiny Guardians, has an additional secret vendor that you don't get in other versions of the game, called Yuna, and she's essentially another microtransaction vendor. Not sure if she's still in that version of the game or if that version of the game still gets updated, but there were tokens that you could purchase somehow and then actually spend at Yuna to buy exotics. And of course that's a little bit wild versus what we have in Destiny now. You wouldn't necessarily anticipate being able to pick up exotic armor for real money. Nonetheless, that's Yuna. If any of you guys know, let us know if she's still a thing down in the comment section. The next thing I wanted to mention is something that the community have named the Galaxy Pools. And I believe it was something that was first discovered by a bunch of folks on Raid Secrets. Not entirely easy to credit the person who originally found it now, but this is an area in the European Dead Zone, which is actually far off out in this skybox behind the broken shard of the Traveler. I'm showing some gameplay right here of Galaxy Pools posted by Matt on YouTube. And the crazy thing is that you've got this kind of architecture floating there. The normal skybox for EDZ disappears, and instead you can just see kind of out to space. And in the distance we can see this galaxy. It's something that's been in the game since Forsaken, I believe, but has never had any kind of use. It's never a place that we've visited or seen as part of a cutscene. You also have to be fairly accomplished at sparrow flying and things like that to even be able to get to it. So just an interesting secret area that was never used right there. Next interesting thing though, is that there was a leaked Vex cinematic, I believe quite a few years back, in 2016 or 17, and it was posted on a reel by the company who'd actually helped to produce it. It wasn't something that related to any content we had at the time in Destiny, and just when we thought it was never going to be used, it actually re-emerged and Bungie used it as part of Season of Undying. It was part of the introduction cinematic for that. And also in the background of that Vex cutscene, there is an area that looks a lot like the lake at the pit of the Pyramidion, which kind of takes us on to the next thing we're going to discuss, which is Io and the Pyramidion, which have an interesting history in terms of development. And as far as we know, back in 2015, I believe, Jason Schreier, working for Kotaku, revealed a bunch of information about content reboots in Destiny. And of course, he was a pretty notorious leaker of Destiny content. And in some of those leaks, he said that the House of Wolves story was also changed quite a bit before the DLC launched, and that the Taken King was rescoped several times as Bungie removed sections like Pyramidion, which was an area on Mars that will contain a new strike and raid. And at the time, he said we may see that in Destiny 2. And of course, we did see it in Destiny 2, but it kind of confirms that Bungie had already made a version of this in Destiny 1. And at the time, it was actually in the Mars bubble. It's interesting because this was cut from Taken King. However, the PvP map Crossroads in D1 was released in the Taken King era, and that map is set on Mars, and in the background we can see a structure which basically is identical to the distance version of Pyramidion. But then if you look more at the map, especially things like the rotted out trees, the sand and the general landscape, as well as the mix of Vex architecture, when we switch over to Io, we can see that Io seems to have pretty obviously started out as this Mars bubble which was cut from D1. And so Io is a reskin of a Mars space, if you like. Obviously they kind of adjusted the color palette, added different plant life and made it look less sandy, I guess. But another interesting thing looking at Crossroads, that PvP map is where we first got man cannons in Destiny as far as I'm aware. and they were absolutely all over the place on IO as well. Of course, IO is now a sunset location, and even though it's gone, it's interesting to see how many bits and pieces made it into D2 from earlier D1 concepts and production. Also, according to Jason Schreier, Bungie had ideas around the Taken King, like an activity called Dares of the Nine, and he said a source compared it to Halo's custom games, and in these dares, players would have a time limit to complete specific tasks, including defending territories and killing aliens with relics to get rewards from the Nine. And it's just interesting because, of course, we saw that as part of the Bungie 30th anniversary, and some of those gameplay elements kind of sound correct, at least in terms of a loose concept. And there was also that natural Halo tie-in with the 30th anniversary as well. And so some of these ideas can be funneled pretty far down the road before really being fleshed out or revisited and expanded upon. Very final mention associated with Taken King, but that's also where we saw an unreleased exotic get leaked into the Destiny 2 database, and that was Dubious Volley. It was never released in Destiny 1, but came out in Destiny 2, and of course is known as the Wardcliff Coil, so we can thank that Taken King era for a lot of ideas that Bungie later materialized in the game. The final set of things worth mentioning here are some unreleased items in Destiny 2, and a Vengeful Arch on Destiny the Game Reddit did make a list that was pretty useful of some of the items that are visible in the database but have never actually been obtainable in the game for whatever reason. And a lot of these go all the way back to year 1 of Destiny 2, with weapons like the Time Card, a legendary sidearm right here. We can see it's a Soros sidearm. Not necessarily crazy weapons, but they never actually dropped in the world. There's also an Omolon grenade launcher here called Bushwhacker, and that was another one that we never got. And then I believe around the Warmind period, we found this exotic ghost in the database called the Iris Pulsator Shell. It's this cool kind of hologram ghost right here. We were curious about it for a while because there was no known source, and then it simply continued to never become available. Until Festival of the Lost, I believe a couple of years back, Bungie released a shell called the Ocular Fortitude Shell, and as we make a comparison right there, we can see that the Iris Pulsator Shell was basically turned into that instead. A bunch of other cosmetics here as well, an exotic sparrow called Blast Chariot. That one was never released. There's also an Unwilling Revolt, an exotic ship right there. And then some interesting consumables and perks. One of them is the Sorrow Accelerant. This one's related to Altars of Sorrow. I believe we could get one other consumable to actually use in the game, but it says use at the rituals in Sorrow's Harbor to skip difficulty phases of Altars of Sorrow. I don't believe that's something we'd ever been able to do. Then in Season 6, there was a perk called Custom Weapon Effects to apply custom weapon effects to a weapon, with no idea what that actually means. It sounds like possibly a visual thing. Who knows, it could have been an earlier idea for something similar to what we get with mementos now. Then there was a weapon perk called Fistfuls of Bullets, and melee kills overload the magazine to double its capacity. That's something we've never been able to roll on a weapon. And there was also Flourish, where defeating combatants with grenade abilities increases this weapon's damage. And by the looks of it, that was probably reworked into Adrenaline Junkie. And so it's an interesting mix really, stuff that we get to see in trailers but never get to see in the game. Leaked cinematics that come out years before they actually end up being used. Of course, Bungie have repurposed some of this stuff, right? And I always found IO really interesting because it obviously had been developed as Mars at some point. And even today we have items that are in the database, have been kind of put into the game but have never been obtainable for whatever reason, weren't necessarily finished, or are just threads of sort of abandoned ideas. And so guys, I hope the video was interesting. Once again, it was something a bit different, but I figured there was some cool stuff to take a look at, so add your thoughts below. And if you have any other things that you can think of, feel free to drop them in the comments as well. But if you've enjoyed the video, a rating down below really does help us out. And if you want to keep posting on Destiny 2, feel free to get subscribed and turn on notifications for more content. And otherwise, I appreciate you tuning in and hope you have an awesome day.